We're here today with Greg Duncan, who was the PAA president from 2008, and we'll be asking a number of questions. The first set is about how you got into demography and training and mentorship and your ideas about how current graduate students should be trained, etc. There's a second series of questions about how your career has changed over time and how you think demography changed over time. And then we have a third set of questions about the PAA specifically and what are big issues for it and how it might influence the course of demography. We have an hour, and you might have a different set of priorities. Some of the questions you might really want to hit on, and if we're ignoring them or miss them, feel comfortable, bring them up and get a chance to talk about these things. Because in some ways, I think it's going to be, the questions are set for maybe an older kind of PAA president, somebody who came up through population research centers, had a sort of a set of experiences in the context of being brought into contact with demography that's different than yours.
Right.
So in some ways, I think this is going to be fascinating for us, although sometimes the questions might look a little weird from someone coming from your particular background. But I think this is definitely where demography is going. So this is a fun potential interview. I'm thinking in particular the first question, to understand what led you to demography and how you help lead others to demography. It's going to be interesting to hear your answer, because I don't know how much you self-identify as I'm a demographer as opposed to something else. So you've got the question.
All right.
Tell us what you think about it.
So I'm basically, I call myself undisciplined. I'm not really a demographer. I'm not really an economist anymore. I'm not interested in what I've become in terms of a name. I got my PhD at Michigan, but I did not take any demography classes. I was in economics.
I was going to ask you that.
Yeah. But I started working on the panel study of income dynamics at the Institute for Social Research. And that forces you to become a demographer. Panel study of income dynamics was started in 1968, right? Representative sample of families that were followed every single year. So merely keeping track of what happened brought me from this view of placid demography to very active demography in terms of family life. So we had to account for all the ins and outs in households, all the residential moves, all the fertility and mortality events. And it was tough to do, and there were many exotic kind of demographic changes that no one had anticipated, right? So it was really something that I was forced to confront.
Right.
And I kind of learned it from scratch in watching it unfold in the course of the study itself. I remember I joined the PSID study after 5 years, and we were doing analyses. And we were doing analyses of things like poverty dynamics, income dynamics. That was really the fundamental purpose of the study. And after 5 years, we confined most of our analysis to families that hadn't changed very much. The head of the household, back then it was okay to say head of household, hadn't changed, right? And that was not even 80% of the families we were looking at. And all the action in terms of moving in and out of poverty, moving up and down the income scale, was happening in the 20%, right, that we weren't even analyzing. So that was a time when, dynamically it became clear that it wasn't very useful to think about a family as a unit of analysis because it changed so much, and that it was much more useful for analytic purposes to think about individuals, right, and the kind of family circumstances in which they were embedded at different times. And that changes a lot, and those changes account for a lot of the economic changes that are happening to these families.
You know what might be helpful for sort of a reader who's coming into reading your transcript?
Right.
Would be if you could give us a very brief background to the panel study of income dynamics. There's a history there. I think something started a little earlier.
Right.
But what was the idea behind it in terms of the unique
Right.
way of collecting data?
Right. Well, it's 25 years of my life, right?
Right.
So
it's a big
maybe
chunk.
I should spend a little
we
bit
should
of
talk
time
about
explaining.
it.
It began in the midst of the war on poverty.
Right.
If you can believe, the United States actually declared war on poverty in the 1960s and fought a hard battle that spent a lot of money. But up until that point, our knowledge of who was poor and so forth came from the cross-sectional CPS surveys, right? So you got a snapshot, 20% poverty this year, 19% poverty next year, 21% poverty next year. But you never knew whether it was the same people, right? And I think people assumed it was often the same people. And they assumed, therefore, that poverty was a fairly persistent condition. But unless you followed the same people over time, you really never knew. So the whole idea was to create a longitudinal study. And the original conception was to start out with just low-income families and follow them. But Jim Morgan, who's my mentor and who will be memorialized tonight at the service, he just died this past year, successfully argued to the Office of Economic Opportunity, which was the agency at that time, that it was important to begin not just with low-income families, but with everybody, because it was as useful to understand who became poor as who left poverty. So that was the design. It was a representative. It was oversampling low-income families, but it was basically a weighted representative sample. And the idea was to follow those individuals in those families every year, originally for 5 years, right? So at year 5, that was 1972, that was the year that President Nixon put the OEO out of business unceremoniously overnight. And someone, I don't know if this story is true or not, it's a nice story. When responsibility for the PSID was transferred from OEO into the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation, somebody wrote on the file, "This is a 10-year study."
Right.
It had never been talked about as a 10-year study before. So they assumed it was a 10-year study, so it went on for another 5 years, and then the National Science Foundation started picking it up.
And it's still going on today?
Still going on today, after 50 years. So it started showing all of this turbulence that people really hadn't expected. Poverty for a lot of families was short-term, not long-term. Welfare receipt was short-term, not long-term. If you keep following people over time, you can start looking at intergenerational kinds of issues. Are the kids coming from low-income families or welfare recipient families? How likely are they to be poor or receive welfare? And those figures were fairly small, surprisingly small. I mean, there was a persistent component, but there was a big transitory component.
Now, if we could connect your entree into demography as you see it to the discipline itself, it's kind of interesting because you're at Michigan.
Right.
And you've got Ron Friedman has a population center.
Right.
And it too has a history that begins about the same time. I think 61 or 62, Rockefeller gives some money, and pretty soon it's USAID, and it's internationally focused, and it's on rapid population growth and particularly understanding fertility in Asia.
Right.
And if you think about what population existed, what population meant at that time and what demography meant, it had this kind of focus in the early 70s.
Right.
And you're at the same place at the same time, no connection as far as you can see. I mean, your agenda is more domestic, and it's PSID, and it's economics. So your graduate training is economics and labor economics? And
Right. So my early analyses were what a labor economist would do. But then I became increasingly interested in family kinds of economic changes, which brought me into this demographic world. Not formally, right, but just I was forced to confront what demography was all about.
If we think about what demography has become, you're sort of like a precursor to what's happening to demography by the late 80s and 1990s,
right,
where you do have a much more domestic focus on family dynamics,
right,
and these types of poverty questions. So
And then
it's kind of interesting.
by the late 80s and early 90s, I'd become interested in not just poverty dynamics, but the effects of poverty on kids, or the effects of welfare receipt, or the effects of neighborhood poverty on kids, right? So that got me into research networks of various kinds, collaborations with developmental psychologists. So in the 90s and later, I really started thinking about, I don't know if it's demography, but it was about family circumstances as it related to child development.
So, and this is, in the context of your career, associated with a move to Northwestern? When you left?
Yeah, in 95
Michigan.
is when I left Michigan. It was, I had started this transition maybe in the late 80s.
Right.
So by 1995, it was fully underway. You know, with Michigan, I love Michigan. I still love Michigan. I just knew if I stayed at Michigan, I would still be working for the panel study of income dynamics. Today, you know, despite the fact that everyone agreed it would be good to take a break, but I just knew I couldn't. And I also was at the Institute for Social Research in a soft money, non-teaching position, right? So I wasn't really working with graduate students. And I wanted to work with graduate students. You know, occasionally I'd be on a committee.
Right.
But it wasn't really until I got to Northwestern where, and it was into a school of education where I really started working
And at
full-time.
Michigan, you tended not to teach?
I just taught a few courses here and there.
Just a few courses.
Yeah, it was kind of an overtime thing.
In overtime.
Yeah, and you know, after into the 80s, the transition from Jim Morgan as being the director of the PSID to me took place.
And that in itself is a full-time job.
That was
And
a
then
full-time job, right, right. You know, the fundraising, NSF funded the study, but it only funded 2/3 of the study, right? So you had to come up with the additional money somehow. And that was.
And you did that by attracting outside sources of funding, and they got to tack on some extra questions.
Exactly, exactly. So you sell this at average cost and not marginal cost, and you know, try to cover some of the fixed costs.
And what did you think of those added questions? Did they tend to enhance?
You know, in the early
findings of the
days,
study?
we kind of got to make up the questions ourselves.
Okay.
We just had to agree with the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation Office what the topics might be.
Right.
But gradually, as NSF became in control, there was a time after a couple of years with the National Science Foundation, there was a board of advisors, and they became the board of overseers.
Right.
And Jim Heckman, who I'm sure everyone knows, wrote a letter to Jim Morgan, I remember saying, pointing out this difference, and he hoped he appreciated that it was not merely a semantic difference. So anyway, the setting of the agenda became much more NSF-related thing, plus we started connecting with National Institute on Aging, Robert Sussman, NICHD, and some of the supplements were focused on the kinds of things that NIA was interested in. We added wealth supplements, transfer, interfamily transfer kind of supplements. And then just after I left, I initially tried to get money for the child development supplements, which started in 1997, but they didn't start really until after I left.
So a couple of observations. We had a set of questions here about your experience in graduate training in demography and the training you give your graduate students. And in your particular case, this really didn't happen at Michigan that much. You didn't have a set of graduate students and a set of courses that you taught.
Right.
And in the context of your training, it was very much associated with these issues associated with PSID. So by the time we get to Northwestern, where you are teaching and having grad students, they weren't your normal population center grad students.
Right.
So you had, I think, a program on policy and education.
It was in the education school. It was social policy and child development, basically.
Right.
But you know, as I tried to argue in my presidential address, and after attending PAA for a number of years, you kind of get inculcated with a population perspective. And I tried to impress upon my students how important a population perspective was. And they appreciated that, I think. And, they've gone off to, in one case, a couple of cases, sociology department, policy schools, social work schools, a couple of them, sometimes to think tanks like RAND and Mathematica and places like that. So they all went off, I hope, with an appreciation for the power of a population perspective, even though their particular interests were more motivated by a policy perspective. But, if you want to know about, if you want to think about the impacts of some kind of policy on kids or families, you really do need a population perspective for that too, right? So.
Yeah, I did have a question about my recollection of the presidential address was kind of interesting, because you have this population perspective, which I can fully appreciate. So if you're going to, it seemed to make demography very apropos for accurate descriptions. So if you want to describe what's happening, make sure you have either a census where everybody is asked, or a real randomized sample where you get a
Right.
representative sample. And that's population perspective. The second part of the talk I thought was the more interesting one, when you got into coming up
avoiding
with
a
more,
population perspective,
right?
right? That
coming
was the
up,
second half of
right,
the.
The second half of the talk was if you want to come up with regression models focused on understanding causality, there you said, if I remember correctly, that oftentimes what demographers might do with something is kind of many times inappropriate. So if you wanted, I think the example you had, if you wanted to understand education's impact on fertility, and you go out and develop this nice little model, you've got lots of potential problems there, because you've got unidentified variables that might, in point of fact, really raise significant questions about causality or your ability to
Right.
actually.
So in the first half, I tried to point out that demographers should be talking with ethnographic
Right.
researchers, right? Because they typically choose convenient samples when it's just as easy
Right.
to choose a population sample, and it's more powerful to choose a population sample. I worked on a couple of committees for the National Academy of Sciences on the National Children's Study, and there was a big battle in NIH about whether this should be kind of a clinical recruitment
Right.
study or a national population sample. And there were just wildly inaccurate perceptions that when you go to a population sample, it triples the cost, it quadruples the cost, right? And it really doesn't. When Sarah, who's at Princeton? Heck, thank you.
Oh, that's right.
Sarah McClanahan, my good friend. She started Fragile Families,
Right,
right?
Fragile Families.
And the original plan was not to have a representative sample of hospitals. And I put her in touch with Steve Herringa, who's a sampler at Michigan. And, he convinced her that at virtually no extra cost, she could do her study with a nationally representative sample of births in cities of 200,000 or more, right? So there is a lot of power in a population perspective. I think analytically, for ethnographic studies, for example, it helps ensure that you're covering all the bases, right? You're not pre-selecting your people based on some set of factors that you often can't control. But the second half, you're right. It was this idea that even if you start out with a huge population database,
Right.
if you want to understand causal impacts of, let's say, some policy change that happened in some state, but didn't happen in neighboring states, right, in one particular year, but not other years, you really want to subset down your big sample, right, to focus on the variation, in this case, policy variation of interest, or maybe some environmental change, right? But that's just a small subset. And you can try to run our kind of correlational regressions, or and it was emerging at that time, there was this perspective of being able to think about generating something that might was kind of a quasi-experimental
Right.
thinking.
Now,
about
how successful has that message been in the context of having an impact on demographic research? I'm just thinking of all the sessions that are going on
Yeah,
right now,
right.
where they seem to be making the mistake you pointed out.
Right. It's a lifelong battle, and there's much more of it now than there used to be. There, within economics, for example, if you go to the policy meetings, the APAN meetings, but some epidemiologists, but some demographers too. I think they appreciate this kind of perspective and look for those kinds of natural experiments. But it's not universal,
Right.
and it's a continuing discussion that's
Hasn't been
interesting
totally
to have.
resolved yet.
It's interesting
Right.
to have, right? But at the same time, you may focusing on some particular slice of variation of interest gets you into a particular population at a particular time, right? And there's this issue of generalizability.
Right.
And ultimately, you'd really like some sort of convergence between a big population approach, typically done by demographers, and the kind of quasi-experimental approach. So I ended up trying to promote this idea of convergence of results. So I think there's room for both, but in doing research, I think it's often good to try both and see what sort of picture you get for both.
Now, in your transition, and it seems like a significant transition from Michigan and PSID research to First Northwestern and now UC Irvine, it seems like you've had to incorporate new areas, of topical areas for yourself. Child development is a big area, and education is a big area, and taking a look at a set of issues that most economists aren't inclined to look at. So particularly that whole host of your research that takes a look at particular years of a child's life being so much more important in terms of outcomes, whether
Right.
it's health or educational achievement or like. Now, how was that like for you to have to become familiar with whole different sets of research and disciplines as well, and then the groups you worked with, particularly in this new context, were definitely interdisciplinary groups.
Right.
So if we think about demography changing in a similar type direction as you changed yourself, it would be great to have that kind of description of someone who is open enough to begin to incorporate the works of others and other disciplines and try to make a sense out of the whole thing in terms of a coherent research agenda.
Right. And again, Jim Morgan here was my mentor along these lines. He was an economist, and he was interested in economic behavior, but he realized that economic models weren't sufficient to explain the kind of demographic outcomes and economic outcomes that he was interested in. So the more eclectic, the better for him. ISR was a very interdisciplinary place. It was wonderful. And the fact that it was a soft money organization, and the fact that the arrangement with the university was that all the overhead from grants would come to ISR and be used to build buildings and fund sabbaticals and things like that. It created much more of an interdependence, across people, across disciplines within the institute. But I guess absorbed from him the idea that academics are supposed to be curious, and they're not supposed to think of boundaries that they can't cross. And if you really need neuroscience to understand how a child develops, then you better learn some neuroscience, right? If you really think it's some sort of biological systems that are affecting, that are translating, let's say, early adversity into how a child turns out, then you better learn some of that. And I've never tried to be comfortable in what I know. I always try to go out and give my next talk with a 10% chance that I'll look silly because I'm trying to learn new stuff, right? Because that's what That's what being an academic is all about, right? So if that happens to center on demography, then that's great. If it happens to center on developmental psychology, that's great. If it happens to center on neuroscience, that's great. But why let disciplinary boundaries constrain your thinking in any way? It just doesn't make any sense.
I think you might be, I wouldn't say unique, but unusual in that context, because if you think about what tends to take place.
Right. That's their problem.
But could you give a presentation at the American Economics Association meetings on your current research and have a receptive audience who would fully understand what you're doing? Or would you need another context? Or would that audience not be attuned to appreciate the introduction of child development literature and research, et cetera?
There have been things I've looked at that economists would not be very interested in, right? Now we're just starting. I gave advice at a conference last week to early career people, and one of my pieces of advice was swing for the fences every 10 years, right? Really go for a big project every 10 years. So my current big project that we're just starting now is to run a random assignment experiment where we're recruiting 1,000 mothers around the country at birth, when they gave birth, all low income, and we're randomly assigning half to getting $4,000 a year as an income supplement, and the other half are getting $240 a year. So it's $333 a month, month after month for the first 40 months of their kids' lives, 333 versus 20, right? And then we want to see to what extent economic behavior changes, labor force, other kinds of, we want to see how parenting changes, we want to see how stress changes, and ultimately it's a neuroscience collaboration, right? We want to see to what extent at 36 months kids' brains are wired up more efficiently. So, it's a very interdisciplinary project, but I think economists would appreciate the fact you've got an experiment, the fact that it's income-based, that we're thinking about the kinds of things, there are models about what money can buy that will help kids. But, that connects well, but there have been things I've been looking at from time to time that probably don't
You want that
connect.
go for at least 10 years to get educational achievement consequences.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, it's $16 million for 3 years, and we're thinking ahead. PSID was only supposed to last 5 years, and now it's 50 years. So never say never on a longitudinal study.
So no, go ahead.
Question before we get too far beyond this, because one of the things that's really interesting about your interdisciplinarity is the very fact that, to my recollection, you are the only PA president in a long time who's not come from a population center. So, if I recall correctly, you were kind of transitioning actually from education at Northwestern to education at UC Irvine,
right,
when you became PA president. And I'm wondering how do you see that having transpired? Because you're the outlier that says to somebody who's not in a population center, hey, I'm not constrained in my life just because I'm not in a population center.
Well, we are trying to get a population center going at Irvine.
Okay.
And one of the attractions of coming to Irvine was it had some good demographers. Okay. So I remember 2008, the meeting was in New Orleans, and I was in the airport, and it was heavily recruited by the demographers at UC Irvine.
Okay.
But so Judy Trees is there, for example,
right,
and I've talked a lot with her. So and we're thinking about what a population center at Irvine might look like, and it's some traditional demography, but it's really, and this is, I think, a general characteristic, to what extent can demography connect with other fields, with biology, for example. One of the people at Irvine interested has a big salivary cortisol stress lab, and would fit in well with some vision of a population center, right? David Newmark is there. He's a labor economist. And he really is the one who put together the data center at Irvine. So, you know, he's a demographer in some sense, and has another agenda that he could bring to a pop center. It seems like the more, you don't want it to be too unfocused, but you want to have a lot of strands of research going on for people, especially students, right, to be exposed to different kind of perspectives, different kind of problems. Broader the better is my philosophy.
Okay.
A quick follow-up question on that, particularly since you're thinking of establishing a population center. What is your ideal training for grad students at such a center, particularly with your focus on we've got to have topical importance and you have to come up with a set of research tools that give you sort of enough expertise to do good research and enough flexibility to easily cross disciplinary boundaries? How do you do that in a curriculum?
That's a good question. You know, one approach, and we haven't gotten to the point of designing a curriculum, but having some fundamental exposure to economics, some fundamental exposure to sociology, some fundamental exposure to developmental psychology, to demography, and then having speakers come in touching on all these subjects, having opportunities for students to work with more than one mentor, I think is very good. You know, the disciplines think in different ways. They have different vocabularies. Oftentimes the vocabulary words are different, but they're really talking about the same kind of concepts. So I think an important part of the training is to expose students to these very different ways of thinking about things, ways of talking about things, and to realize that in the end they're, you know, variations on the same theme rather than totally different balkanized kind of areas. And I think the more of a common core, you know, I could imagine at Northwestern we had a education training grant, and we were fairly paternalistic in the kind of courses that we required to, you know, be exposed to different disciplines. And in some cases it took people an extra year to finish their PhDs. So there was a sacrifice, right? But the bet, you know, there's a lot of wonderfully productive work within disciplines if you go deeper and deeper and deeper. But I think the bet of breadth is that you can combine ideas, very different ideas, in a way that's going to be better. You're going to understand more with the combination than if you were just operating within one discipline. And some students get excited by that. Some faculty members get excited by that, and some want no part of it.
Now, we had a question about sort of your perception of how demography as a discipline has changed over time. And in some ways, I see you as the ideal person to reflect on this topic, because you were sort of external to a lot of the dynamics that fueled the change. Now, obviously, as a discipline, it becomes institutionalized academically with the inflow of funds about a particular problem, rapid population growth in the developing world. And there you are at Michigan, where you have sort of what was happening in the demographic world in terms of demography, with the establishment of all these internationally oriented fertility-specific population programs. And then again, almost from the outside, you saw how shifts take place in terms of what the big issues are. You've got you know, a big concern with aging, and then you have a refocus again of funding, and population center focuses on aging, and you have AIDS and HIV. You have migration. They seem to come in a sequence.
Immigration.
Yes, and in some ways you're standing outside this, except in 2008 you are the president of this association, in which most of your fellow demographers have sort of if they're old enough, experienced all these rather dramatic alterations and research focus and funding. So what do you, as this ideal outsider, make of this transformation of this discipline?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I think demography is a nicely flexible kind of discipline. It's been able to adapt in very, very useful ways to these big problems as they've come along. I think it speaks well for the integrity of its structure. And, you know, I think that's what a discipline should be. As these big problems come up, social problems of various kinds, either domestically or internationally, you want research to make progress in solving those problems. And sometimes, you know, a discipline just can't be informative for solutions to problems. But demography, you know, has always had fundamental insights that have been useful for thinking about those kind of problems, right? So I think it's held up very well as a discipline in that sense.
Okay.
Right? And, you know, with the meetings, there's always been a kind of a basic demography component. But there's always been these satellite connections, right? And sometimes they've been on AIDS, sometimes they've been on aging. There's a lot of aging research these days. It comes and goes with the kind of funding.
Right.
You know, when aging got built up with Richard Sussman and his funding empire, which, you know, in retrospect was really wonderful, it draws people in.
Right.
And PAA has always, you know, sometimes you've got a gerontological society that pulls people off, but if you think about it, as aging became a very big area of research, PAA captured a lot of that action, right? And I think it's to PAA's credit that it does. It provides a flexible kind of program structure. I think, you know, it's the right size meeting. I don't know what it's up to now, but it was, what, 2,000 to 3,000 before? It's probably still in that range.
It's around 3,000.
Yeah. You know, everybody comes, so you meet your old friends, and there are always some interesting sessions to go to. So it's an accommodating structure for these, you know, changes in very, very important kind of social problems that come along.
Just one counterpoint. We've had a number of past presidents, PAA, who were kind of all coming from 50s and 60s, where they had this kind of training at population centers,
Right.
in which they perceived demography to be not an interdiscipline, but
Right.
a real discipline.
Right.
And they had this core central concept of population, and then you had your demographic process variables, fertility, mortality,
Right.
migration, and you had to understand how they interacted to change size and composition, and you had a set of unique methodologies, use of life tables, etc.
Right.
That gave you a distinctiveness. And they look at these changes and they become concerned.
Right.
And they're not as flexible as you are in terms of focusing on, well, what's the best tools for dealing with a problem? They're saying, well, where's demography?
Right.
And I didn't get any of that in the context of your ability to move along.
Well, formal demography is vital, and I'm glad it's still a vital part of PAA. But as you say, it is a bit inflexible. And, you know, I think any discipline kind of holding on to some definition of its core without being open to thinking about connections with other disciplines, I just think that wastes some of the potential energy and value that demography can provide.
Now, this I guess it's a PAA question, maybe a demography question too. As a researcher, you have been really focused on better understanding particular areas that are problematic from the point of view of society, particularly in the context of your interest in child development consequences of poverty, etc. You've got a lot riding on good quality policy research that's based on empirical data, that this research can perform a wonderful function of making your programs and policies more effective in solving problems. What does someone like yourself, who has invested a career in doing that, do in this larger environment that seems to be encompassing us now, which doesn't appreciate evidence-based research to formulate effective social policy? Just doesn't do it.
Right. Well, it did it 2 years ago. Right? Things change. Things change.
I mean, that's a very partisan perspective on it. But I'm not saying it's inaccurate.
Right.
Right.
But these things come and go.
Right.
And you could argue that the previous administration, Obama administration, was more evidence-based than almost any administration had been in the past.
Right.
Ron Haskins has a nice book about this called Show Me the Evidence. It's certainly gone downhill in that respect since then, but you just keep fighting the good fight. And I've been connected with some of the National Academy of Sciences committees, and Ken Pruitt, former director of the Census Bureau. Now Columbia is really trying to lead a fight on behalf of social behavioral sciences, right? And to make sure that not only demography, but also the more conventional disciplines within social and behavioral science, that their value is appreciated. And people will be elected that don't appreciate it, but we need to keep training our students to understand the value, and we need to keep plugging away in convincing the public that it's valuable.
Well, I was thinking particularly about students in the future. Now, in my mind, it wouldn't be surprising if you were somewhat more pessimistic than you are. You seem to be optimistic, and I hope you're right. But from the point of view of attracting students right now, good students,
Right.
and giving them this belief system that what they're doing is not only valuable, but it's going to be appreciated, and what they do will have a positive impact on the world and the society they live in. It might be somewhat more problematic to do that. It might be harder to attract students and convince them that this is important and something to dedicate your life to. You're a wonderful image of a person who has done that and has really made a big impact in terms of how we understand a whole set of unbelievably significant issues about child development and impact of poverty, etc. But it seems like as an institution, PAA, etc., right now is facing a significant challenge that might make this type of career less attractive and might have an impact on who comes and the nature of our research. And it's hard to just posit a happier potential future as a way of getting around all these immediate difficulties.
I'm an optimist by nature until right now. It's an interesting question whether there's been a fundamental change in the world toward a more authoritarian kind of perspective, toward a more introverted perspective on the part of nations. I can't bear to imagine that that's going to be the case, that there has been, so much progress in our lifetimes that I want more data before becoming a pessimist. And every action has a reaction, and we'll see if 8 years from now, let's say, 10 years from now, we'll be continuing on the positive kind of trajectory that we had up until a couple of years ago.
No, go ahead.
We'll want to
Go ahead, John.
No, you haven't asked a question. You jump in.
I keep thinking about the 50-year study.
Right.
And I would love to hear your thoughts on what's been learned across all of those generations, but also what are the prospects for, continued funding for this study, but also just funding for these longitudinal studies in general?
Well, again, I'm an optimist. Look what happened in the last year. There was a president who came in who wanted to cut, wanted to cut NIH funding, wanted to cut NSF funding, a lot, right? And our own study actually was up for funding in 2017, and there were all these continuing resolutions, and it was make or break in the last 5 months of the fiscal year, and Trump proposed, I don't know, a 20% cut in NIH funding, and it ended up being a 10 or 15% increase. And this last spending bill, just was a complete reversal of what Trump had wanted. So, I think within Congress, obviously, there's just a lot of latent support for NIH kind of research, perhaps NSF research, but the whole. I was on this division of Behavioral and Social Science and Education advisory committee for the National Academy of Sciences, and we were just hearing endless stories about how behavioral and social science funding in NSF was on the chopping block, and there were all these representatives who were trying to get rid of it. And the budget was increased this last year, right? So there's obviously a reservoir of support, even in a very conservative Congress, right, for the kind of research that gets funded. So that makes me optimistic. I also lived through the early Reagan years when they did cut the National Science Foundation social and behavioral science funding a lot. PSID, I think, there was a rescue operation that we mounted. It was mostly Jim Morgan and Tom Juster. And they went to the Sloan Foundation, the Russell Sage Foundation. I can't remember one of the foundation, Ford Foundation, I think, back then, who came up with 3 years of funding to tide them over. And by that time, NSF budget had recovered. So there are these ups and downs. But I don't think, at a surface kind of political level, there are these dramatic anti-science kind of positions, but I just don't know how deeply that runs. And until there's more concrete, think of what could have happened, right? And if it would have happened for a couple of years, then I would start to be discouraged. But
my question was kind of related to that, getting back to the real world of things that have been happening that you've been studying over your entire career, have to do with income inequality and the negative effects for people at the bottom of that. And that seems to be getting worse, not better. All your recent publications show that. How do you see that evolving over time?
I'm more pessimistic about that than I am about funding for social and behavioral research. What welfare reform did in the 1990s is really create inequality within the low-income population. We built up and generously funded a set of supports like the Earned Income Tax Credit, for example, child care subsidies. So families, low-income families, low-skill families that have remained connected to the labor market have done relatively well. Families that haven't been able to be consistently connected with the labor market have done very poorly. And you have these programs like TANF, for example, which replaced the old AFDC program. That's gone. It's really, low-income families are not thinking about that anymore. And if they put work requirements right into the food stamp program, as they're talking about, there's going to be another couple million people cut off from that. There's this cycle in the welfare reform debate, and now we're trying to focus people's attention on policy impacts on kids, right? The whole debate on welfare reform, despite our efforts, was focused on work effort on the part of adults. And that's still the theme, right? There's no thought of if we were to cut this program, what impact might it have for kids, right? So part of that is we just have correlational evidence. We really need experimental evidence, and that's why we're doing this experiment. But it's, people are not sufficiently aware of, I think, the magnitude of the problem. And I really do think we're kind of setting a time bomb here where kids growing up in very, very dire circumstances aren't going to turn out. Some are, but most aren't going to do so well as adults, right? And we really need healthy and productive kids paying our Social Security. That's right. Yeah. So I do worry about this, and I just don't see any hope in the debate, right? Which is in the last few months gotten more and more toward work requirements and everything else. Forget about that. So now you do have me discouraged.
Sorry. You brought it up with your research.
Yeah, okay, all right. It's
So
my
you
fault.
think about your research, and it seems to be so apropos to this particular moment in time. Because we do have these attempts to really have negative impacts on kids. And you can empirically document what's likely to happen. We already know what the consequences are.
Well, do we? I mean,
Yes, I believe your research is very persuasive.
well, you've got to be.
Particularly at ages 3, 4, 5, it's unbelievably persuasive.
Yeah. Well,
And a willingness to put money into education. As a society, we've been extracting money from education.
right.
And we seem to be 100% happy with it. And we see it in terms of taxes. And again, your research shows that this is a misplaced policy to extract money from education. Don't do it.
Right. But I'm not just a researcher, I'm a grumpy researcher, right? So when I see my correlational evidence, and someone else comes along and says, well, it's not poverty, it's family structure, right? It's neighborhood welfare dependence. You can't, unless you've got experimental data, you really can't refute that. And whether income is the active ingredient for the relationship between low socioeconomic status and worse child outcomes.
Just repeat that, please. Relationship between?
Whether income is the active ingredient in the relationship between low socioeconomic status and bad child outcomes is an open question. And that's what we're going to test, and we could find it's not, right? That's what that's what research is all about. And if we do, maybe we'll discover the pathways by which it comes about. That's what we're hoping for. But even if you've got evidence from an experiment, you still might not have any impact. But you're not going to have an impact, I think, unless you've got evidence from an experiment. So that's why we're just after 5 years of planning, we're finally launching it 3 weeks from now. So we're very excited about that.
We're about at the end of our hour. Now, are there questions that we should have asked you that you wanted to answer that we haven't? Some point you want to make?
I'm very glad that demography is in NIH and not in NSF, right? I don't know if you've had historical stories about that, but I think to get crumbs from NIH as opposed to getting a bigger slice from a much smaller pie for NSF has been a godsend, right, for demographic research. I think demographers have done well with the money that they've gotten. I think our program officers at NIH have done an incredible job of defending population research within NIH because there have been many directors who haven't appreciated the value of population research. We were very, very fortunate that Richard Sussman was able to be as entrepreneurial as he was over the years. We
Those are
have a
good
lot
points,
to be,
yeah.
what's that?
Those are good points.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, and we have a lot to be grateful for in that regard. You know, I'm hoping, and PAA is, I think, very effective as a lobbying organization on behalf of the budgets for NIH and NSF. And it realizes how important that is. And I think it's always a struggle for an academic to become involved in the kind of politics of making sure that the budgets are maintained. But you know, actually, another point which is related to this, demographers are wonderful people. When I was president of PAA and I asked anyone to do anything, they always said yes. That never happens with other people, right?
right.
Get an economist, you try to talk him into, well, what am I going to get for it, right?
Might as well return.
So this kind of role, being able, you know, against your kind of normal academic instincts to make the rounds in Washington and pitch in that regard, demographers have embraced that and have been very effective with it. So, you know, we're lucky that the funding has been there, but we're also partly responsible for making sure that that funding is there.
And we should be happy we're not climate scientists.
Right. Right.
Any other questions?
Yes, when you ask.
Do I have to steal your microphone?
Yes, you've got to steal Karen's mic.
It'll be a quick final one.
Sure.
I'm not saying that your career is over yet. There's a lot more to be done, but I wonder if, as you look back on your long career, what are you most proud of?
Good question.
I'm most proud of my graduate students. You know, I like to tell people that an academic's best hope for immortality is not with the next article, but is with the next graduate student. And some people, I think, take graduate student training more seriously than others. And I've always enjoyed it a lot, and I enjoy connecting up again with my graduate students. You know, you always want to send them off armed with the kind of skills that they're going to be able to adapt to the new things that come along, but stay grounded in what the, you know, basic skills are. And I've been very proud of what my graduate students have been able to do. So that's I hope, my legacy.
Well, thanks very much. This was a wonderful interview.
Yes,
Thanks.
It was fun.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.